There is a practice exam going around, so make sure you get a copy. The handout is of a practice exam. It's the same one that I'll show on slides so we can go through it. As you recall, the exam will be Wednesday, so be prepared for that. It covers chapters 5, 6, and 7. There are mostly multiple choice and some true-false. It'll be the same as last time in terms of being Scantron format. Okay, those of you at home, you'll be doing it directly on the exam sheet, however, rather than on Scantron. So I thought I'd go ahead and put together another practice exam and we could go through it to see where you're at in terms of your studying. Hopefully most of you are making good progress on the review that I did on Wednesday, where I diagrammed the cellular respiration and photosynthetic pathways. You know, I'm really serious about that. If you can memorize that and draw that from memory, you're in very, very good shape for this exam. You really are. There's a lot of questions that involve those processes. Okay, so some questions that we might expect to see on this exam, right? This first one. Which of those energy transfers are possible in living systems? Well, if you look at all these answers, certainly A is possible, light energy to chemical energy. That's really what the light reactions of photosynthesis do, right? They convert light energy into chemical energy in the form of high-energy phosphate bonds in ATP. For B, chemical energy to kinetic energy is certainly possible. Our muscles do that when we take ATP, break it down, and use it to power muscle movement or mechanical movement. Potential energy to kinetic energy can certainly be done. Again, if you break ATP down, you've got potential energy that's being released to make or to convert to kinetic energy. Light energy to potential energy. That's really another description of what photosynthesis does, because high-energy phosphate bonds are potential energy. They're stored energy. All right, so the answer, of course, is E. All of those are possible energy transfers that living organisms can do. This comes out of Chapter 5. All right, next question. Which of the following is true about the ATP molecule? Turns out the correct answer is D. You might have wanted to put C, but if you look at C, it says contains the 6-carbon sugar hexose. You might have remembered that there was a sugar in ATP, but it's a 5-carbon sugar, ribose. Right? It's the same sugar that you find in ribonucleic acid. And then B, you might have wanted to put that, but it says extremely stable bonds, and hopefully you remember that those phosphate bonds are not stable. They are unstable, and that's why they have high potential energy, because they can be easily broken. All right, so the correct answer there is D. All right. Third question. What is true about active transport? All right, well, we just look at these answers step by step. A uses ATP as an energy source. That's certainly true. You have to use ATP to power active transport. That's one of the definitions of active transport. It requires energy. So C is certainly correct as well. B can move solutes up a concentration gradient. That's also correct. And the reason is because you can move things, as I said in class, against their gradient. Say you have a high level of hydrogen ions on one side of a membrane versus the other. You can still move hydrogen ions to the outside of that membrane, even though diffusion would sort of want to force them back into the membrane. Okay, you can go against or up a concentration gradient. It can involve coupled passage. We see many examples of that, where cells, for example, will transport sodium out and potassium in with the same transporter. So the answer is E. All of those choices are correct. And of course, if you'd gone through the first two and realized that those were correct, then you know there's only one possible answer. All right, next question. Diffusion. So how would we classify diffusion since it doesn't require ATP usage? Well, by the last question, you know D is incorrect, right? Because D requires the ATP usage. In addition, you know that A, B, and E all involve large-scale movements of material, and they do require energy use. All right, so none of those cytosis answers is correct. Active transport requires ATP, so you've only got one answer left by process of elimination, and you know C is the only option that's available to you. Okay, so by process of elimination, you're able to figure out what the correct answer is. All right, how does heating inactivate enzymes? If you picked answer A, that seems logical, doesn't it? Breaking the covalent bonds. It turns out, though, that only happens at very, very high temperatures. Remember that covalent bonds are very stable. DNA, those phosphodiester bonds in DNA, you can boil those and they don't break. Phosphodiester bonds in DNA can stick around for potentially millions of years. DNA has been extracted from fossils that are in excess of 200 million years old, for example. All right, so covalent bonds are really stable. Heat's not going to do it. Removing phosphate groups, that sort of sounds like it could be possible, but not all proteins have phosphate groups. As we'll see, it's a great way to activate and deactivate proteins by adding or removing phosphate groups. Causing the enzyme molecules to stick together, that's typically not the case. So the answer that you've got left is either you change the enzyme's three-dimensional shape, or perhaps none of these are the right answer. Well, it turns out that the correct answer is, in fact, D. That's what happens. You change the enzyme's three-dimensional shape. Heat disrupts hydrogen bonds and ionic bonds. And when you do that, you change the shape of a protein, and it doesn't function anymore. Just for your own information, there are many other ways to inactivate enzymes as well. Cold usually doesn't do it. It'll slow an enzyme's rate down, but it usually doesn't inactivate them. Abnormal salt concentrations will inactivate enzymes because they alter the ionic bonding properties of enzymes. Okay? So salt concentrations will certainly do that. All right, number 7, I'm going to do 7 before 6. It follows in a better logical progression. So look at 7 first. All right, so what does the term anaerobic mean? Here's a clue. Whenever you see that prefix a or an, it means not. Okay? So these critters are not aerobic. Well, that eliminates one answer. Right. The correct answer is E, without oxygen. Aerobic means with oxygen. So anaerobic, with that an prefix, means not or without oxygen. Okay, so an anaerobic critter lives without oxygen. So now you see why I did 7 before 6. Question 6 asks what you call bacteria that can't survive in the presence of oxygen. Okay, you know they're going to be anaerobes of some sort because they're without oxygen. But what kind of anaerobes are they? Excuse me. All right, if you know what facultative and strict mean, then this is an easy question. Facultative refers to the ability to deal with oxygen or not as the case arises. Yeast are like that. Okay? So yeast cells are facultative anaerobes. They prefer oxygen, they do better with oxygen, but they do perfectly fine without oxygen. All right? So a bacteria that can't survive in the presence of oxygen is going to be a strict anaerobe. Strict meaning it cannot survive in any other conditions. Yes. Microaerophiles. I have not heard that term, but I think given the word construction, it means these are microbial organisms that prefer or love oxygen environments. Yeah. So these anaerobes live in really specific environments. You find them in, buried deep in sediments at the bottom of a lake, for example, where oxygen is very rarely found. Okay, we go on to question 8. What happens during chemiosmosis? Okay, so if you go through all these answers, you know, first of all, that these ions are not moving freely. Hopefully you realize that. In fact, if you've drawn or recall your outline of cellular respiration, you'll just sort of mentally picture electrons going down electron transport chain, hydrogen ions pumped across a membrane back through an ATP synthase. All right, so I'm just visualizing that. And so I can answer this question because I know the ions are not moving freely across. They're moving through ATP synthase. So I know out of all of these answers, B must be the one that describes chemiosmosis. Right? Hydrogen ions move through a protein port provided by ATP synthase. They don't move freely unless you put an anti-coupler in there, a poison that allows them to move freely, like dinitrophenol. Okay, number 9. Which of the following is a result of glycolysis? Again, if it doesn't immediately come to you, close your eyes, picture glycolysis, that diagram that I did. Okay, what I'm seeing is I have a 6-carbon molecule, glucose. I go through glycolysis. I get 2 3-carbon molecules. In that process, the inputs are ATP. I've got ATP coming out. I've got NADH coming out. And that's it. Right? So I know FAD to FADH2, that's not happening in glycolysis. CO2, it's not happening in glycolysis. Conversion of NADH to NAD+. Right? That's not happening. Okay, so the answer is C. Conversion of glucose to 2 3-carbon compounds. See why I'm having you try to be able to draw those outlines from memory? Man, it helps so much. Right? You see a question like this, you close your eyes, bam, there's that picture, and it answers the question. It'll really help. All right, what's true about the energy yields from cellular respiration? All of these answers are incorrect except for A, but let's look at why they're incorrect. B says cellular respiration converts all the energy into high-energy ATP bonds. We know that these energy conversions are inefficient. You can't convert all of that energy because some of it's lost as heat. Right? Second law of thermodynamics tells us that. C converts kinetic energy of glucose into chemical energy. That's incorrect because the energy in glucose is not kinetic energy. It's potential energy. It's chemical energy. Okay? The heat produced during cellular respiration is only a tiny fraction of the chemical energy available. That's also incorrect. It turns out that the heat that's produced is actually a majority of the energy. We get about 40% of the total energy out of each glucose. And in that way, it's much more efficient than an automobile engine, which gets about 23% of the energy of the gasoline that you burn. All right? So gasoline engines are really inefficient. So that means that A is the only truthful statement up there. All right, 11. Redox reactions involve the transfer of what? Gesundheit. Redox reactions always involve the transfer of electrons. D is the correct answer. You might have wanted to put A, right? But that's not the case. You don't always have hydrogen ions going with those electrons, but in a redox reaction you always have transfer of electrons, always. However, the hydrogen ions tend to follow the electrons. So what you do when you're trying to figure out who's getting oxidized and who's getting reduced in these reactions is to look at where the hydrogen ions are being stripped away from. Right? So if you see a redox reaction and it says figure out which of these molecules is being oxidized or reduced, if it's oxidized, look for the loss of the hydrogen ions. If it's reduced, look for where the hydrogen ions went, because they tend to follow the electrons. All right, so that's an easy way to spot them. All right, number 12. Where does the oxygen released into the air come from? Again, if the answer doesn't immediately come to you, close your eyes, try to visualize that diagram I did of photosynthesis. Okay, so I close my eyes, I visualize it, I see photosystem 2 losing a pair of electrons which are passed down an electron transport chain. But we've got an electron hole, and that's being filled in by water, which is being busted down. 2 electrons are snatched away, and we're left with an oxygen. All right, so that's what I'm visualizing of that diagram. The result is that I know the answer must be A. Water serves as an electron donor. That's why I'm saying memorize that diagram. All right, and then you close your eyes, and blam, the answer is right there in front of your face. Okay? It's going to help you so much. Come on, there we go. Photosynthetic organisms derive their carbon from what? This one should be fairly obvious. Okay, if the answer doesn't come to you immediately, close your eyes, see the Calvin cycle. First thing that comes in is CO2. That's what Rubisco does. Rubisco takes CO2, bonds it into organic molecules, and you pull a 3-carbon compound out at the bottom of the Calvin cycle. All right, so the answer is B, carbon fixation. Is the process that we're doing there. All right, number 14. What are autotrophs that use light as their energy source? Well, it's not C. Consumers consume what producers produce. It's not fungi, because fungi can't photosynthesize. Not heterotrophs. Heterotrophs, by definition, cannot make their own food molecules, so you're left with either A or B. Are these critters chemosynthetic or photosynthetic? Should be fairly obvious if you know word roots. Actually, they say that if you're going to study science, taking Latin and Greek is a really useful thing to do, and I wish I'd done it, because you would know a lot of these words right off the bat. That prefix photo is a dead giveaway. It refers to light. Okay, so these are, so B, they're literally light-making autotrophs, or light. They use light to make their own food molecules. Chemosynthesizers use chemicals, hydrogen sulfide, for example, to make various organic molecules. Okay, 15. What is true about the greenhouse effect? Right? The answer, if you read all these through, none of them make sense except for one, which is the very first answer. Removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is the way to counteract the greenhouse effect in part. Unfortunately, we can't remove all of those industrial hydrocarbons that we're spewing into the air. We can't remove all of the chlorofluorocarbons that we're spewing into the atmosphere, although the amount has gone down quite a bit since we've enacted some controls. Since we've stopped using Freon as the typical refrigerant, the amount of chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere has gone down dramatically. But we're still pumping a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, one thing that helps us is the fact there's so much photosynthesis going on in the biosphere that some of that CO2 is removed, and it gets balanced. That gets balanced out pretty well. Unfortunately, we're spewing more CO2 in the atmosphere than photosynthesis can counteract at the moment. Right? So the amount of CO2 keeps going up. All right, so the answer is A. Some of these answers actually talk about adding CO2, and that just makes things worse. All right, number 16. All right, what does this situation illustrate? There's really only two answers here that are possibilities. B and C are possibilities. C is incorrect, though. The reason is because it says some energy is destroyed. The first law of thermodynamics says you don't destroy energy, you just change its form. Okay? It may be unusable energy, but it's still energy. It's still there. All right? So the answer here is the second law of thermodynamics. Energy conversions are inefficient, and some of that energy is lost as heat. Okay, for those of you at home, this constitutes the review, and I wish you luck on the exam, and the next section will start Chapter 9. For those of you in the studio audience, I want you to take out a blank sheet of paper. Please do not discuss the answers for the last page. This is a quiz. All right, what you need to do is put your name and your full student ID number on this blank sheet of paper. And answer those last 5 questions on the last page, 17 through 21.